Hey guys, Palsteron here, and today let's talk about early endgame in Last Epoch. Now this time I got somebody special here. We have Bina from the Maxwell team. He's going to talk to you guys a little bit about the Last Epoch endgame, mostly because I think that is where the most friction could be for newer players. First up, let me introduce him. He's been making Last Epoch content for quite a while now. Bina, what's up, man?
Hey, I'm Bina, and I've been blasting Last Epoch for the past 3-4 years. It's my main game, basically. I'm a big ARPG enjoyer. I love anything spreadsheets, I love numbers, I love math, and I'm super happy to be able to share my knowledge with you guys today.
That's what we're here for. So basically what I want to do with Bina right here is we should be talking about stuff that isn't as obvious, stuff that new players might not be willing to ask. They don't even know stuff like that exists. The smallest of tips after campaign, once you get into monoliths, the progression, right? There might be power curves where all of a sudden your build doesn't feel as strong anymore. We want to avoid you falling off, and that's what we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, basically the early end game and how to progress through it and have a good time.
All right, so the first thing we're going to be discussing is there's certain skips throughout the campaign that are very important to know in case you find a key early. And then we're also going to talk about whether you should be going trade or self-found, depending on what kind of player you are. What are your thoughts on that, Bina? What will you personally be doing, and what do you would say is the best for newer players?
Well, actually, I think a new player, if you're more of a casual player, it's going to be better to go with the Circle of Fortune, which is basically the kind of SSF faction. You'll be finding more gear, and you're just going to have a better time just playing the game and finding more gear for your characters that you will be playing. And then people who want to go with Merchant's Guild, I think that's going to be more for the blasters and the one who play a bit more than maybe, just 1 hour per day. It's going to enable you to buy your gear right off the market as you want it, when you want it. And if you have a lot of gold, then you'll be able to buy, multiple versions of probably LP uniques and try to get, those juicy LP at the Temple Sanctum.
How do you think it's going to play out once you have like your low LP uniques and everything from trade? Do you think SSF could maybe even take over at some point because you get so many crazy exalted items, might even get like double, triple tier 7 exalted and whatnot?
So we're going to have to see how it turns out and how it pans out with the 1.0 launch, because Circle of Fortune is going to have a crap ton of prophecies. I think we're going to be able to stack, I don't know, I think they said like 50 or something. So
yeah, and prophecies are basically these things that where you need to kill certain objectives and then you get a certain reward for it, right?
Yeah, so if you stack all the correct ones, all the ones that you want, and then you can unlock them, you're gonna have to do a certain activity to get the reward. And then with the ranks of Circle of Fortune enabling you to double your prophecies, it could get crazy really fast.
Yeah, I can imagine. And where exactly can we find those factions? I know they're new, so you probably don't know exactly like the quest line or anything like that.
Yeah, so you'll be able to unlock them. We know that it's going to be in Chapter 9. So Chapter 9 is the Majelka Upper District here. We don't know exactly where it's going to be, but it should be at the end of the campaign. So whether you do the full campaign and you get to Chapter 9 and then you unlock your factions, or if you go early into Monos and you get a Temporal Sanctum key, there's also the option of just going through the Temporal Sanctum at Tier 1, which is a level 55 dungeon. And then at the end of the Temporal Sanctum, you end up in Chapter 9 here in Soretka, so you'll be able to skip a portion of the campaign if you wish to do so, right?
So about making your character stronger for early monos, there's obviously a little bit of a jump, right? You go from the campaign to monos. All of a sudden, enemies hit a little bit harder. Your resistances have to be a little bit tighter. How do you get the gear to actually transition? For example, crafting materials. Should I be hoarding them or should I be spending them early? Or
yeah, you definitely don't want to hoard your crafting materials. So you have access to so many crafting materials, and they are so easy to come by. As you can see here, I have like dodge rating, I have like 1,800 of those. Even though I played a lot, these are very common. Some of them are a bit rarer, which are like the class specific ones, plus level to certain skills. But for the most part, you want to craft early and craft often. Last Epoch has a crafting system that is very deterministic, and it enables you to have a less powerful version of the best affix that you want on your gear very early. So it is definitely recommended to like try to craft as much as possible early and try to get on your gear the affixes that you want. There's also another little thing here. You have some other crafting materials. There's runes and glyphs, right? And one rune I want to talk about here is going to be the Rune of Ascendance. So this one changes an item into a unique or set of the same type. Very important stat in pretty much any ARPG is going to be movement speed. So something I always recommend is if you don't have a good pair of movement speed boots and you find an early Rune of Ascendance, depending on your build, right? So if your build requires a very specific unique, you might want to try to Rune of Ascendance an item into that specific one. But if you don't really have one, boots are always good to try to use a Rune of Ascendance to get a nice movement speed boost at the very start of the campaign, right?
Because unique boots always have movement speed, right? That's basically the gist of it.
Yeah, they all have movement speed. Some of them have higher than others, but it's quite easy to get one with like a good amount of movement speed early on, right? So if I use one, actually got a pretty good one here. Level 30, and you see 13 implicit movement speed and 27 as an affix. So that's a lot of movement speed early on for level 30.
All right, so let's say you now in monos and you try to progress. Obviously, you don't want to stick in normal monos for too long. For people who don't know, there are empowered versions of these monos which have way more loot. So you kind of want to get there as fast as possible. What are the tricks in order to make this transition to empowered monos as fast as possible?
So the first thing to note is that there are two ways you can go into monos, right? The first one you get into is the Fall of the Outcast. They only have a choice to go either to Stolen Lands or to the Black Sun. So all the timelines, all of these islands here are called timelines, and the ones on the left here are only drop rates related. So these does not provide any character power. So what you want to do is early on, you want to go to the right side and unlock these timelines to be able to get some character power. Because each of these timelines, when you kill the boss, you have access to a blessing, a choice of a blessing, which is kind of like a passive buff to your character. So you see here I have spell damage leeches health, I have some chance to shred lightning res on hit, and then I have some necrotic resistance here. So all of these provide character power, which is going to make your time much easier to get into empowered monoliths.
Basically, the only ones you have to do are the 3 at the end, right? You don't have to do the left ones at all. You completely skip them, then you do the 3 ones at the end, then you can unlock empowered monoliths, right?
Yeah, so you do these 3, and then you come back to the little rock here. You interact with the rock, and then it unlocks Empowered Monolith, which is going to be level 100 for every single one of these.
So one of the important things in Last Epoch is there is 7 types of resistances, right? And depending on the class, it can be harder or easier to actually cap those. So you can't always cap those. Are there important resistances that you should cap first, depending on what monos you're in?
Yes, there are. So basically, the first mono here is very heavy on necrotic damage. So you will want to get as much necrotic resistance as possible. One thing to keep in mind is that you only need as much resistance as the area level that you're in, up to 75%. So for the first one, since you won't have tier 5 affixes on all of your pieces of gear, you only need to go up to 58%, right? And then 66 for the second one. So the first one is necrotic. The second timeline is very heavy on void, and pretty much all of the timelines are very heavy on physical as well. So those would be my 3 types of resistances to try to cap out very early on, right?
Lagon is one of those fights that's pretty rough. We're going to talk about it in a second, but it's pretty rough on lightning and cold, right? So at that point, probably look out for that as well.
Yeah, that's kind of like a big roadblock for a lot of newer players. You know, you get to Lagon and you just get one shot by his laser. Yeah. Capping your cold and lightning res here is going to be very important, as well as physical. Keep in mind, even with cap res, you cannot tank his laser. You must avoid it, right?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. But another thing to note as well is that in the end of time here, you have a gambler, which you can gamble for gold rings. Gold rings have an implicit that go up to 18% elemental res. So with 2 gold rings and a couple of affixes on your gear for necrotic and void, you should be good to go for a long time here in the monos.
Nice. All right, so we just talked about Lagon. This is a big roadblock for a lot of people, me included. I've definitely had my fair share of deaths in this boss fight. Do you in general have some tips and tricks maybe for newer players to not get completely obliterated over and over?
Yeah, so the first thing, as we talked earlier, is that you need to cap your cold and lightning res here and your physical res. These are going to be the most important ones. This laser here, as you can see, its eye turned red. When it turns red, it means that he's preparing an attack. So usually you want to be on one of either side of the arena, and then when its eye turns red, you go to the opposite side. As you see me here going left and right, that's going to be the easiest way to, mitigate all of this boss mechanics. Then you go down here once you reach the halfway point of the fight. Waves will spawn. In the monos, they spawn in a counterclockwise fashion, and in the campaign, they spawn in a clockwise fashion. So as you can see me here, the easiest way to deal with this is that you just follow the waves, you just follow behind the waves counterclockwise, and that way you're ensured that you will never get hit by these waves. Again, make sure that you're resistance capped though. If you ever get hit, that's going to mitigate most of the damage. The second half, there's going to be waves coming at you at the same time, and Lagon gets much more DR, so he gets tankier. So you'll have a harder time bringing his health down. There's one funny thing to keep in mind is that because it has less DR in the first half, if you have enough damage, you can actually skip the entire second part of the fight if you have enough damage to bring him down quickly.
Damn. And then basically when you kill the tentacles, the fight's over, right?
Yep, exactly.
Perfect. All right, so let's say that you've completed all the monos and now you're in empowered monos. All of a sudden, you get absolutely stomped by some, I don't know, poison snakes or whatever. What happens next? How can you improve your character? And should you go back to normal monos? Should you proceed? What are you going to do?
So you definitely don't want to farm in non-empowered monos. The most important thing is getting that area level to 100, and that's going to give you the better drops and the better chances at the best items in the game. So you just want to focus on your gear, right? Make sure your resistance capped. Make sure you have different layers of defense. So maybe if you're a health build, you will go endurance, for example. Make sure your resistance cap. Make sure you have health on most of your items. The big roles, the big affixes that you're looking for is going to be increased health on your helm, chest, and belt, and hybrid health on your belt, boots, and gloves. So these are going to be the most important roles for health, and that's going to be the most impactful for your EHP here, right?
Yeah, I guess another thing is also you have to have the sustain to actually get your HP back, so you can always be at max HP. And you can't just always spam potions, obviously. Is there more things that you can do kind of to sustain, for example, if you're on a minion build?
Yeah, for sure. Actually, on a minion build, you can go health regen as well, right? You can go health regen in... there's a blessing in Ending the Storm, the Lagon timeline, where you can get health regen there. Or if you're just a regular spell build, basically, you might want to go with a source of leech. Or if you're a melee build, you can go with some melee health on hit. But that is kind of just for progression. Ideally, in the end game, you want to get to a point where you're leeching health off of your damage, or you have another source of good health sustain, like health regen, for example. Oh, and another thing, actually, implicits are extremely important. So as you level up, you unlock different bases for gear, which have implicits, and these implicits can have a huge impact. As you can see, these Crusader gauntlets, they have like up to 45% void resistance. So that's an entire tier 5 affix of void res. And this is pretty much across the board. There's a lot of different implicits that you can get. Make sure that you're updating them, especially on your weapons as well, to get even more damage for your build, right? Because a low level weapon, even though it has all the perfect affixes you need for your build, it might not have the correct implicit, and that is going to have a huge impact with the amount of flat damage that you can get on your build, right?
I guess also for all the PoE mains, in terms of flat damage is super important because your skills don't really, they don't really get much flat damage while leveling. So most of your flat damage, especially on spells, is going to come from your weapon, right? So getting that flat damage up and upgrading your bases is sometimes way more important than even like having an extra 2 stats on it or whatever.
Yeah, and another thing to note, if you're coming from a PoE background, weapons have no local modifiers. It's all generic, basically. They're just stat sticks.
Yeah. Right? It's all global. Yeah. All right, so let's say we fixed our gear now, but here is the end game grind that's going to start, right? So now you have all your uniques, kind of. They're still not upgraded with LP or something. There's a lot of things to upgrade, but in general, where do you go from here? What's like the play? How can you get extra power on your character? How can you target farm it?
So once your gear is fixed, and then you want to farm some empowered blessings. These are going to be the same versions of the non-empowered blessings, but just with higher rolls, right? It's just free power for you to grab. So make sure you're focusing on the ones that gives resistances first, and your defenses. Once your defenses are covered, you go into the more offensive ones like Shred Lightning Res on hit, or whatever you need for your build. There's like some minion damage, or you get some crit multi. Shred is going to have a huge impact on your damage. It's essentially a separate multiplier, right?
Yeah, it's like 50 pen or something, 50 pen, right?
Yeah,
like 10 stacks.
50 pen, but it's 60% less effective against bosses. So actually against bosses, it's only 20, but you know, it's small detail.
Okay.
So the biggest thing as well is that you might get lost at some point and you don't know exactly. You get to a point where you stagnate with your gear and you're not quite sure where to go next. Like, oh, should I be farming for my body armor? Should I be farming for another weapon? Like, what am I looking for? Well, the main thing to note is that you want to set yourself goals, right? You must take a look at your gear, take a look at your build and see, okay, this is where I can get the most benefits. It's going to be getting this pair of gloves with LP, or getting this weapon with LP as well, or getting this exalted body armor. So you might prioritize different parts of the game if you know where to target farm, right? So all of these timelines have different echo rewards. So you must farm the correct timeline based on the reward that you want to have. If you're looking for boots, for example, you want to go into the Spirits of Fire timeline, because that one will actually have echo rewards for unique or set boots. Each mono will tell you exactly here, exclusive echo rewards. So Spirits of Fire, it's going to be boots, and they all have different rewards, right? So you want to target farm the correct timeline. And if you're looking for a boss specific drop as well, for example, you're looking for a Twisted Heart of Vulcaros, you want to go in Reign of Dragons and farm this timeline. So setting yourself goals and knowing where to go next to get your next upgrade is always a good path to building your character's power even further when you start feeling like you're stagnating.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the one thing I guess we haven't talked about at all is dungeons and arenas, the other end game systems we've only been blabbing on about monoliths. What would you say is their place in the whole end game economy, and should you do those early at all?
Early on, you might not want to go into dungeons unless you want to skip a portion of the campaign. For example, we talked about going to Chapter 9 with Temporal Sanctum, but in general, you only want to go into dungeons when you actually want something from it, right? So if you have a unique with LP that you want to slam, you go to the Temporal Sanctum. If you want to have a specific unique from a specific dungeon, then you go do it, right? But there's little reason to do it very early. It's mostly an end game thing that you'll do, right?
Yeah, and I guess arenas, as I know from personal experience, is only for like tryhards, right? You want to do the leaderboards.
Yeah.
But in terms of gear, I personally have never really seen any reason to go in there.
There is gear in between waves, but this is not where you farm your gear. This is just to test your might, basically. Try to go as high as possible. Although there is another version of Arena, which is Arena of Champion, which is also tied to specific drops. So these are kind of like considered kind of like a dungeon, basically. But the Endless Arena is just for the latter, basically.
All right, sounds great. That was a great compilation of everything you need to know, especially for Path of Exile players coming over. This is going to be incredibly helpful. Thank you so much for the rundown. I definitely also learned a lot. Where can people find you?
You can find me every weekday on Twitch, basically twitch.tv/BinaQC, and you can find me on YouTube as well. And yeah, basically with the 1.0 launch, I'll be there very often. So feel free to come by and ask me any question. I'll be very, very happy to help any of you guys out.
All right, man. Thank you so much for coming.
Hey, thank you, pal.